This is video 6 of the 4th Street Software 1927 AL project discussing the batter skill set expectation as called upon by the pitcher's D100 rule. I've taken some data out of the simulations that represent about a million, little over a million plate appearances for these expectations. We got about a little over 6% of the time we'll see power be called upon. And when that occurs, about 7% of the time we'll get a home run, and about 9% of the time we'll get a hit. If park is called upon, 13.5% of the time, we'll see a home run result in about 3.5% of the time, and a hit about 81.5% of the time. Let's take a look at Scheid Park as why that might be. So the only place in a ballpark effect that can result as an out is where there's these X's delineated, where defender is most likely positioned. Straight at the large X is an out. The smaller X surrounding will be a range check for the out. But by far the most predominant areas of the ballpark do not have an X or expected defender, and these will be hits. Out here past the fences in gray, home runs. Out here in the dark green, doubles, and then green in the tan areas will give us singles predominantly. Now when the individual defender is called upon, such as a pitcher, about 6% of the time, we're going to expect about 38% hits, 2% of the time the first baseman, about 38% hits again, about 6.25% of the time the second baseman, yielding about 34.5% hits. The third baseman almost 4% of the time, yielding 34.5% hits. The shortstop a little over 6% of the time, yielding about 35% hits. The catcher about 3.25% of the time, yielding about 35.5% hits. Now when we get to the outfielders, taking a look at the left fielder, we're a little under 4% of the time. The hits have dropped down to 23% of the time. The center fielder is almost 6% of the time, and the hits are further dropping to about 20.5% of the time. And then the right fielder is almost 5% of the time, with the hits dropping to 22.5% of the time from the infield. Now when pitch command and control is called upon, this is the most common skill set that'll be called upon at 35% of the time. Instead of hits, we'll look at how many walks we'll be generating, which is about 22% of the time we'll get a walk. Now if we aggregate all the infielders together, we get about 27% of the time they're called upon, and they're going to yield about 36% hits. The outfielders aggregated is almost 15% of the time, and they'll yield about 22% hits. If you're following along, these didn't add up to 100% of the time, because about 3% of the time the simulation would bunt. So in that case, we get some hits out of bunts, but not very many. When I was doing the project, as I've mentioned before, I chase runs scored. That combined with my home run project that I did yielded these expectations of how to spread out the batter skill sets. So now it's time to look at some player cards.